Hello, this is Tim from Vintage RC Garage. Today I'm going to try something new. This video is a continuation of my Clod Buster Shelf Queen project and will be the complete build of kit number 5865 in trimmed normal time. I will provide the teardown and the full project time lapse in another video. I hope you enjoy it. The Clod Buster only requires one steering servo. Given the size of the tires and weight of the truck, it could have benefited from a dual servo setup and the ability to accept a 1/5 scale servo like the TXT1. It is always nice to have the servo rods measured out to the right length ahead of time, but in most cases you will still need to adjust them once your build is fully complete to get the right trim and ride of your build. The chassis is the centerpiece of everything. The entire suspension system works off multiple ball connectors attached on the side and bottom of the chassis. These ball connectors are bigger than what you see on most of the Tamiya 1/10 versions. The bottom of the chassis houses a trap door that provides easier access to the servos once everything is assembled. The front body post mounts are taller than the rear. They attach from underneath along with a stabilizer bar across the chassis. The front chrome bumper attaches directly to the chassis but does not provide any real protection from a crash. The rear body post mounts are shorter than the front and are also mounted from underneath with a stabilizer bar across the chassis. The steering servo is mounted in the middle of the chassis with two large steering rods extending to the front and rear of the chassis. On the Clod Buster, the battery holder is mounted perpendicular to the chassis where the holders extend out beyond the width of the chassis. One of the ends screws in and the other end provides a quick release latch that allows fast access to changing the battery. The Clod Buster speed controller has more wires than most Tamiya kits. The reason for this is the dual motor setup. There is a nice 6-prong connector provided that helps keep wires tidy. Be mindful of the wire color connections in the manual. Also make sure you lubricate the speed controller with switch lubricant in order to get better life and connection out of it. The speed servo and the speed controller both get mounted to the electronics tray. It takes a bit of effort to tackle the wrangle of wires, but take your time now and cleanly organize your wires in order to make it easy to lock them down later. The manual's diagram is a bit confusing here, but the motor connection wires actually route through the holes in the bottom of the chassis where the steering rods exit. After organizing all the wires, go ahead and lock down the tray and the heat resistor. During the next 17 steps, you will be building a single axle assembly. The instructions tell you to do the steps, repeat them again for the second axle. Found it easier and faster to just build 2 of everything for every step. This is also the steps where I would recommend buying the ball bearings upgrade. Once the gearbox is complete, you don't want to have to rip everything apart later in order to upgrade the plastic bearings with the ball bearings, so do yourself a favor up front. Make sure you grease all areas that will see friction liberally. You will be glad later if you do. A bit of a warning, however, during the axle shaft assembly, be very mindful of where you put your E-rings. On each gearbox I got one E-ring in the wrong place. The problem is that you do not realize this until you have the entire gearbox completed and go to insert the drive shafts. This meant that I had to completely take apart almost all progress and repeat steps 16 through 36 again. This kit has a lot of small parts, screws, and nuts. Other kits seem to go together faster because they don't have so many smaller parts and steps to put together. Okay, let's dive into the gearbox. The axle arms attach to the gearbox in an unusual way. The screw heads are inside the gearbox and secure via a flange nut on the outside. It doesn't make for the most aesthetic outcome, but I guess it works. I bought 2.5 Clod Busters a while back with the plan to make a brushless monster truck with them. See my TXT1 project build video for more details. However, I quickly realized that it is hard to use that power with a Clod Buster without major chassis mods, so I abandoned the project. I figured it was time to pick it back up and restore them to their original glory. Secure down those inside-out screws real well so you don't get any vibration while running. All 4 halves of the gearbox need to install an axle, 4 screws and nuts each. Make sure you grease the gears well and also make sure the gears are seated into the gearbox correctly. You will know when you try to put the halves together if you got it right. There are 2 main gears in each gearbox as well as 6 gears that make up the differential. The main gears each take a bearing on each end. Also grease the bearings and the shaft they sit on. When inserted, give them a spin or two to make sure they turn freely, and also as a way to distribute the grease. If you have globs of grease, the first time you run the motor, it will just all fling off the gears and not provide the protection you need. Repeat the same on the second axle. When building the differential gears, make sure that you snap the 3 small gear rods into the main gear securely. If these are loose, you will regret it later. In addition to these 3 small gears and rods, the diff is completed with 2 larger gears that propel the drive shaft while still allowing slip. Another word of warning here, there is a small asterisk in the directions when you put the halves together that reminds you to insert a single 3mm nut inside the gearbox. You can dab a small drop of grease on it to help prevent it from slipping out before the halves come together. If you forget this nut, you will need to completely take apart the gearbox to insert it, and as you see, that does require removing a number of screws. Use a single small screw to secure the halves until the rest of the screws are completed. The gearbox is held together with 5 screws in 3 different lengths, plus another 2 long screws to secure the motor, each with its own 3mm nut. Time to close her up. The second gearbox goes together exactly the same. Time to move on to the motors. This kit has a pinion spacer tool. I have seen these before and always wondered what the tool was for. Setting correct pinion spacing. You'll learn something new with every project. Take your time setting the pinion gear because if you don't set it correctly, you can easily script the gears. This is not as important on these older 540 brush motors, but the more modern motors can shred gears in an instant if it's not set right. There was a cracked motor mount that I needed to replace. Luckily, I had a spare new parts tree that still had one on it, so I was able to put back a brand new one. Make sure you insert the metal spacers inside the gearbox. These will help keep a tight hold on the engine and screw so the vibrations are minimized. Repeat attaching the motor to the second axle and give a second pass on all the screws that secure the gearbox together. The dual motor and gearbox setup is also unique. The front and rear axles are identical and each axle gets its own motor. In the TXT1, the dual motor propels both axles from a single gearbox. The next major addition to the axle is the suspension and sway bar assembly. This is by far the most overly complicated part of the entire build. Start by attaching a number of ball connectors that the shocks will attach to. Do the same for each of the 4 bars. The long plastic arms straddle the axle and rotate on a large ball on the axle. This is secured onto the axle with 2 more pieces. One opposite the ball and the other slides into the opening that allows it to slip onto the axle. Each of the 4 connections take a total of 5 screws to complete, and that's only one half of the assembly. The other half we will get to later. Don't forget to grease the ball on the axle that the stabilizer rotates around. Now repeat each of those steps for the second axle. In the middle of the sway bar, you attach 4 braces that connect to the chassis on the large ball connector from before. This setup allows the entire axle assembly to rotate up, down, left, right, yet still have a limited range of motion. This is where you insert the last part of the sway bar I mentioned, then you get to do it all over again with the second axle. One of the key pieces that make the axle strong are 2 metal braces that connect the end of the axle shaft to the gearbox. This prevents side stresses from snapping the plastic axle, which is a much needed addition for a truck this heavy. Attach the metal supports on the second axle as well. Big wheels need big wheel hubs. The Clod Buster has 4 identical hubs. This is another place where you should put ball bearings and also make sure that everything is properly greased. Now complete the remaining wheel hubs. Pay attention to how the ball connectors go. Only 2 get double connectors, and it is important to note which orientation they are installed. The servo savers are a throwback design. They remind me of the older SRB chassis style. They consist of 2 rounded pieces that fit into each other, but when turned in opposite directions they separate. They are connected with a screw and a tension spring. When stressed, they will separate some because of the spring. This helps reduce the stresses transferred to the servo, which could easily break because of the weight of the large tires. Attaching the wheel hubs to the axles is where I finally realized that my drive shafts had the E-rings attached incorrectly. The hub would not seat correctly, so it would not line up. So I had to undo all the steps back to the beginning where the axle and gearbox was completely disassembled. This was not a fun activity. Make sure the washers are inserted into the hub holders and grease them accordingly. The large step screws do a great job holding everything strong. When you attach the servo savers, pay attention to which way they face. The correct end must face toward the steering rod coming from inside the chassis. Grease here also helps. Wash, rinse, repeat. The last addition to each axle is the bumper and bumper guards. The bumper attaches with 4 nuts and screws that lock them into the guard. When attaching the guard to the gearbox, pay attention to the direction of the orientation of the longer side versus the shorter. In my first attempt, I had the guard reversed and needed to disassemble it to swap it and correct the mistake. The attachment point on the bumper is not a hole but rather a U, and the screw and nut combo keeps the parts together. This way, if too much force is applied, then the bumper should pop off before it breaks. Once together, you can now attach it to the axle with 4 screws. Repeat that again for the second bumper. And there you have it. Your double axles are complete and ready to attach to the chassis. This is where the rest of the sway bar complication shows itself. The red supports need to be snapped onto the large ball connectors on the bottom of the chassis. Also, a metal triangle with an opening is inserted behind the large ball connector on the side of the chassis. Each sway bar is attached to this triangle using 3 small screws. I suppose this part is metal because of the high stresses placed on it when the sway travel maxes out. Once the axles are on, the suspension setup starts to make a little sense. I still have never seen a setup with so many moving parts. Repeat the entire process on the other side. At this point, things are starting to really look like it's nearing completion. Shocks and tires, and we are ready to move on to the body. But first it's time to complete the 4-wheel steering. If this was a runner, after you complete attaching all the steering rods, it would be a really good idea to turn on the radio and make sure the steering trim and toe-in is what you want. The 4x4x4 steering is a unique feature and is Tamiya's first 4-wheel steering kit. In reality, the all-wheel steering only works if you are not going to be traveling fast. If you want to go fast, I'd recommend locking the rear steering rods and run it with a standard front axle steering configuration. Shocks next. Have I mentioned you should upgrade these? There is a rubber tube that is added to the bottom of the travel arm that reduces the range of motion and helps them from bottoming out. You can play with its length to get more travel, but trust me, you should just upgrade. Each one gets a spring and capped on the end. The bottom is snapped onto the ball connector we added to the stabilizers. Once the shocks are together, it's time to attach them to the chassis. There are 8 total, 2 on each wheel. You need to insert the screw in a long sleeve to stabilize the screw to the chassis. Then the screws are attached with a flange nut on the inside. Once the screws are all socked down, you just need to use a pair of pliers to snap the other end of the shocks into the ball connector that was added in the middle of the sway bar. Now just do that 3 more times. Okay, there you have it. That is it for the chassis. Go ahead and put it aside and we can get started on assembling the body shell. The roll bars first. I was disappointed with the realism of this part. Tamiya usually does better with its hard shells. There are just too many clips and screws to complete this one. It gets attached by sitting on blocks in the back of the bed truck. Both the front grille and the rear tailgate use a metal support attached to it so that it can get screwed into the body shell securely. Fit the rear bumper onto the tailgate and it's ready to attach. This version of the Clod is the more sought after version that still has the Chevrolet name on the tailgate and the Chevy symbol on the front grille. These branding details were removed from the body in later productions. Flip the shell over and slide the windshield into place, then attach it with 2 screws. The rear tailgate clips into the body shell and attaches via the metal bar. Then do the same for the front grille. The main problem with this setup is that each of the 4 corners of the shell attach with a small screw and nut. This attaches on a fairly fragile part of the shell and is a common area for the shell to break off. Repeat this for the front grill. Snap it into the shell and secure it with the metal bar. The front shell attachment point for the small screws is even more fragile than the back. Once the front and back are on, the shell is complete. The chrome is shining and everything looks great. Let's take a quick tour. Time to move on to the tires and rims, one of the most characteristic parts of the entire kit. The previous owner never painted the rims and the white plastic had yellowed some. I decided to give them a chrome-like finish. After washing the plastic down with Tamiya body cleaner, I set them up for spray. I use Spaz Stick Smear Chrome. This paint does require a high gloss back base coat for maximum shine. I ended up applying 3 coats of the black base. The first coat should be light. After the base coat is complete and thoroughly dried, you can move on. I like to give the base coat a full 72 hours to dry before applying the mirror chrome. The chrome also took 3 coats and the first coat should be extremely light. Then you can finish it off with a few more coats. Once the rims have completely dried, you can assemble the tires. The instructions say to glue the tires, but since this is a queen, I skipped that step. Double check the tire orientation of the tread with the left and right orientation, otherwise you will end up redoing them when you attempt to put on the tires and notice a mistake. Work the tires over the rims one lip at a time to avoid ripping them. Make sure the inside and the outside tucks nicely into the rim. The black tires really make the chrome pop. Just need to complete 3 more. Time to use a little movie magic, and what do you know, they are all done. Go ahead and throw the chassis on a work stand and we can get these big beauties installed. Slip on the hub insert that locks into the rim when tightened down, then slide the tire on and secure it with a lock nut. Make sure the hub insert grooves are seated with the rim so that there is no slippage when you accelerate. Finish the rest of the tires off. 1, 2, 3. Once all 4 tires are installed, there is only one more thing left to do, and that's pop the body on and admire your handiwork. The Clod Buster is a great build. I've always loved the oversized trucks, even in 1/1 scale. This one turned out great and is now in perfect condition. I highly recommend getting your hands on one and making it a project. Thanks for watching my rebuild of my Tamiya Clod Buster 5865 Shelf Queen. Stay tuned for the next part of this video where I will do the complete project time lapse. Also make sure to catch the teardown video too. Subscribe to my channel and catch all my exciting new content. See you next time.